Sometimes a single moment can shatter everything you thought you knew about yourself. Sometimes it takes a child's innocent words to reveal the emptiness in a man's heart. Victor St. James built a tech empire worth billions, but success couldn't fill the void inside. At 62, he lived behind walls of wealth until he found 8-year-old Ava sitting barefoot beside a dumpster. When he offered her $1 million check, her response stopped him cold. "Can I give it to my brother?" He made sure I ate. Those words cracked open 30 years of buried pain. What began as charity became Victor's most important mission, saving Ava and her missing brother from their dark past. But can a man who built walls around his heart learn to love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 47th floor of the Meridian Tower offered a view that cost Victor St. James $12 million to acquire, yet he rarely looked up from his monitor to admire it. The sprawling city below moved with the rhythm of 8 million lives, each carrying their own hopes and struggles. But Victor had long ago stopped seeing people as anything more than market demographics. His corner office commanded respect with its handcrafted mahogany desk, walls lined with patents and awards, and the subtle hum of technology that had made him one of the wealthiest black entrepreneurs in America. At 62, Victor possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that could dissect complex algorithms in minutes and predict market trends with unsettling accuracy. His company, Nexus Technologies, had revolutionized data processing systems, making him a billionaire before his 50th birthday. Yet for all his success, Victor lived like a man under siege. His daily routine had become a fortress of predictability. Coffee at 5:30. Black and bitter, an hour in his private gym, pushing his aging body with the same relentless drive that built his empire. Breakfast alone, while reviewing overnight reports from his international offices. The 20-minute drive to Meridian Tower in his armored sedan, windows tinted dark enough to shut out the world. The employees at Nexus Technologies knew Victor St. James by reputation rather than relationship. They spoke of his brilliant mind, his ability to solve impossible problems, and his complete lack of warmth. He moved through meetings like a precision instrument, cutting through inefficiency with surgical accuracy. Those brave enough to approach him with personal conversation found themselves facing a polite but impenetrable wall. "Mr. St. James doesn't do small talk," his assistant Sarah would warn newcomers. She had worked for him for 8 years and could count on one hand the number of times he had asked about her life outside the office. The penthouse apartment Victor called home reflected his success, but not his soul. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided another expensive view, this time of the harbor where million-dollar yachts bobbed like floating trophies. Italian marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Original artwork adorned walls that had never heard laughter or seen tears. Every evening, Victor returned to this magnificent emptiness. He would heat a gourmet meal prepared by his chef, eat it alone while reviewing business reports, then retreat to his study. The study served as his true sanctuary, filled with the computers and screens that made more sense to him than human relationships. It was in this study, in the bottom drawer of his antique desk, that Victor kept his most guarded secret. Buried beneath corporate contracts and legal documents lay a single framed photograph, its silver frame tarnished from years of being hidden away. The picture showed 2 children, a serious-faced boy of 12 with intelligent eyes and a gap-toothed girl of 8 whose smile could light up a room. They sat together on the front steps of a run-down apartment building, the boy's protective arm around his little sister's shoulders. Victor could remember the day that photograph was taken with painful clarity. Mrs. Henderson from next door had borrowed someone's camera, insisting that family pictures were important for when you grow up. She had no way of knowing it would be one of the last pictures ever taken of Victor and his sister Melody together. Their mother had died when Victor was 10 and Melody was 6, leaving them in the care of an aunt who viewed them as burdens rather than blessings. The apartment in that photograph was their last real home before the system took them away, promising they would be placed together, promising they would be safe. The promises were lies. Victor and Melody were separated within weeks. He was placed with a family who saw his intelligence as a ticket to prestige, pushing him toward academic achievement while treating him like a project rather than a child. Melody was not so fortunate. Her placements grew increasingly unstable, each move taking her further from her brother and deeper into a system that failed her at every turn. Victor had tried to find her, even as a teenager. He wrote letters to social services, made phone calls that went unanswered, and saved every dollar he could earn to hire someone to help locate her. But the bureaucracy was impenetrable, and his age made him powerless against it. The last time he saw Melody, she was 15 and standing in a hospital room, her once bright smile replaced by hollow eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. She had been in 7 different homes by then, some caring, others indifferent, and at least one that had damaged her in ways that went beyond physical neglect. "They say I'm too much trouble," she had whispered to him during that final visit, her voice barely audible above the machines monitoring her fragile condition. "They say some kids just can't be fixed." Victor had held her hand and promised he would fix everything once he turned 18. Once he had legal standing to fight for her. He would become successful enough to take care of them both, powerful enough to beat the system that had torn them apart. But Melody died 3 weeks before his 18th birthday, her heart giving out from complications related to years of inadequate medical care and neglect. The system that was supposed to protect her had slowly killed her instead. The funeral was small and impersonal. Victor stood alone beside her grave, wearing his first suit and carrying a rage that would fuel him for decades. He made 2 promises. That day, he would become wealthy enough that no bureaucrat could ever ignore him again, and he would never let himself become vulnerable to that kind of loss again. He kept both promises with ruthless efficiency. Victor threw himself into his studies with single-minded determination, earning scholarships to prestigious universities and graduating at the top of every program. He started Nexus Technologies in his garage, working 18-hour days until he collapsed from exhaustion, then getting up to work 18 more. Every success was dedicated to Melody's memory, and every dollar earned was proof that he had overcome the powerlessness that killed her. But somewhere along the way, the armor he built to protect himself from further loss became a prison. The walls that kept out pain also kept out joy, love, and human connection. He achieved everything he had promised at Melody's grave, yet felt more alone than ever. Now, 30 years later, Victor lived in a world where his wealth could buy anything, except the one thing he needed most, someone to love and be loved by in return. He had colleagues, but no friends, employees, but no family, and enough money to last several lifetimes, but no one to share it with. The photograph in his desk drawer remained the only evidence that Victor St. James had ever been capable of love. Every few months, usually late at night when the loneliness pressed against him like a physical weight, he would pull out that picture and remember what it felt like to have someone need him, someone he would have died to protect. But those moments of vulnerability were rare and carefully controlled. Victor had learned to function without emotional attachments, to find satisfaction in professional achievements and material success. He told himself it was enough, that the pain of losing Melody had taught him the wisdom of self-reliance. He was wrong about that, though he wouldn't discover it until he met a little girl sitting beside a dumpster with her brother's drawing clutched in her dirty hands. On that particular Tuesday morning, Victor followed his usual routine with mechanical precision. Coffee, exercise, breakfast, the armored sedan cutting through traffic toward another day of profitable isolation. He had no way of knowing that His carefully ordered world was about to be shattered by 8 simple words from a child who reminded him of everything he had lost. The universe, it seemed, had been waiting 30 years to offer Victor St. James a chance at redemption. Victor's driver, Marcus Webb, a quiet man in his 50s who had worked for him for 6 years, took an unexpected turn off the highway that Tuesday morning. Construction had closed their usual route, forcing them through a part of the city Victor rarely saw. The Meridian Tower existed in a bubble of prosperity, surrounded by gleaming office buildings and upscale restaurants. This detour led them through neighborhoods that time and economic progress had left behind. "Sorry about this, Mr. St. James," Marcus said, glancing in the rearview mirror. "GPS says this should only add 10 minutes to our trip." Victor nodded absently, his attention focused on quarterly projections displayed on his tablet. But as they moved deeper into the south side, something made him look up. The contrast was jarring. Broken sidewalks where million-dollar infrastructure projects stopped, corner stores with barred windows replacing the boutique shops he was accustomed to, and people whose clothes spoke of struggles rather than success. They paused at a red light near the intersection of Maple and 3rd, beside a vacant lot that served as an unofficial dumping ground. That's when Victor saw her. A little girl sat cross-legged beside a dented green dumpster, her back straight despite the circumstances. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with dark skin that caught the morning sunlight, and hair braided with care despite its need for washing. Her clothes, a faded pink t-shirt and jeans with holes worn through both knees, were too large for her small frame. But it was her shoes that stopped Victor's breath. One sneaker was missing entirely. The remaining shoe was more holes than fabric, held together by strips of duct tape that someone, likely the girl herself, had applied with careful precision. Her bare foot was dirty but uninjured, suggesting she had grown accustomed to walking this way. What struck Victor most was her posture. She wasn't slouched in defeat or crying for help. Instead, she sat with quiet dignity, carefully examining something in her hands. As the light remained red, Victor found himself studying her face. She had the kind of serious expression he remembered. From his own childhood, the look of someone who had learned too early that the world could be harsh, but had decided to face it with courage anyway. "Pull over," Victor heard himself say. Marcus glanced back in surprise. "Sir, pull over here. I'll just be a moment." The sedan eased to the curb, and Victor stepped out before he could question the impulse driving him. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the broken pavement as he approached the girl, who looked up at him without fear or surprise. Her eyes were the color of warm honey, intelligent and watchful. "Hello," Victor said, his voice softer than usual. "Are you all right?" The girl tilted her head, considering him with the seriousness of someone much older. "I'm fine, mister. Thank you for asking." Her politeness caught him off guard. Despite her circumstances, someone had taught her manners and proper speech. Victor knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, he could see what she held in her hands, a piece of paper, carefully folded and refolded until it was soft as fabric. "What's that you have there?" he asked gently. Without hesitation, she unfolded the paper and held it out for him to see. It was a drawing, clearly done by a child, but with remarkable attention to detail. The crayon artwork showed 2 figures holding hands in front of a small house. Flowers bloomed in the yard, and a large sun smiled down from the corner of the page. At the bottom, in careful block letters, someone had written, "Ava and Marcus forever." "My brother made this for me," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that transcended her situation. "Before they took him away, he said, as long as I keep it safe, we'll find each other again." The simple statement hit Victor like a physical blow. Memories of Melody flooded back. Her drawings taped to their bedroom wall, her absolute faith that their separation was temporary, her belief that love could overcome any obstacle the world placed between them. "Where is your brother now?" Victor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The people came and said he was too old to stay with me in the last house. They promised he'd only be gone for a little while, but that was 6 months. Ago, I've been looking for him ever since. 6 months. Victor's throat tightened as he imagined this small girl navigating the streets alone, carrying nothing but hope and a crayon drawing. The system had failed her just as it had failed Melody, separating siblings with bureaucratic indifference. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ava Marie Thompson. I'm 8 years old and I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, but you seem nice." The trust in her voice undid something in Victor's chest. Here was a child who had every reason to be suspicious of adults, yet she still chose to see goodness in the world. It was the same faith Melody had possessed until the system crushed it out of her. Victor reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook, a decision forming in his mind before he could fully process it. He had solved countless problems with money throughout his career. Surely he could solve this one. "Ava," he said, writing quickly, "I want to help you. I'm going to give you something that will make sure you never have to worry about food or shelter again." He tore out the check and handed it to her. $1 million made out to Ava Marie Thompson. It was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, enough to guarantee her safety and education, enough to hire the best people. To find her brother, Ava took the check and studied it with the same careful attention she had given everything else. Her lips moved silently as she read the numbers, her finger tracing the amount written in Victor's precise handwriting. Then she looked up at him with those honey-colored eyes, and the words she spoke next changed everything. "Can I give it to my brother instead? He always made sure I ate." The simple request shattered 30 years of carefully constructed emotional armor. Victor felt tears he hadn't shed since Melody's funeral burning behind his eyes. This little girl, who had nothing, wanted to give away a fortune to take care of someone else. She possessed the kind of selfless love that his money couldn't buy, the kind of devotion he had lost when his sister died. "Oh, sweetheart," Victor whispered, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. "We're going to find your brother. And when we do, you'll both be safe. I promise you that." Ava's face transformed with a smile that reminded Victor painfully of Melody's expression in that old photograph hidden in his desk. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it with all my heart," Victor said, and realized he was speaking the truth. For the first time in 30 years, his heart was fully engaged in something other than building walls around itself. As he helped Ava to her feet, Victor noticed how carefully she folded the drawing and tucked it into her pocket. Then she bent down and picked up her remaining shoe, the torn, taped sneaker that barely qualified as footwear. She held it against her chest like a treasure. "I have to keep this," she explained. "Marcus helped me fix it before they took him. He said even broken things can be made useful again if someone cares enough to try." Standing there on that broken sidewalk, holding $1 million check in one hand and a destroyed sneaker in the other, Victor St. James understood that his real education was just beginning. Money could buy many things, but it couldn't buy the love that shone in this little girl's eyes when she spoke of her brother. It couldn't purchase the hope that kept her searching, or the faith that brought her to accept help from a stranger. For the first time in 3 decades, Victor felt truly wealthy, not because of what he owned, but because of what he had chosen to give. Victor's first instinct was to solve Ava's situation the way he solved everything else, with money and influence. He made 3 phone calls from his sedan while Ava sat beside him, still clutching her brother's drawing. The first call was to his personal attorney, the second to the mayor's office, and the third to the director of the city's Department of Children and Family Services. The responses were identical: sympathy, promises to look into it, and requests to go through proper channels. Within an hour, Victor understood that his usual methods of cutting through bureaucracy would not work here. The system that governed vulnerable children operated by different rules, ones that his wealth and connections couldn't easily bypass. "We need to take you somewhere safe while we figure this out," Victor told Ava as they drove through the city. He had cancelled his morning meetings, something that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. Ava studied the drawing in her lap, smoothing out the creases with gentle fingers. Marcus drew this when we lived with Mrs. Patterson. She was nice to us for 3 whole months before her husband came back from prison. The casual way she mentioned these details broke Victor's heart. This child spoke of displacement and uncertainty as if they were normal parts of life, because for her, they were. "Tell me about Marcus," Victor said, surprising himself with the request. He rarely asked personal questions, but something about Ava's situation demanded more than his usual professional detachment. Ava's face brightened immediately. "He's 12, and he's the smartest person I know. He taught me how to read before I even started school, and he can fix anything, toys, shoes, even broken windows. He used to tell me stories every night about all the places we'd go when we got old enough to take care of ourselves." She traced the figures in the drawing with her fingertip. "Marcus drew this because he said sometimes people forget what they're waiting for. He said if I kept this picture, I'd always remember that we're family, no matter where they put us." Victor found himself studying the artwork with new appreciation. What he had initially seen as a simple child's drawing revealed itself as something more profound, a declaration of love, a promise of reunion, a testament to the bond between siblings that no system could truly break. They arrived at the Department of Children and Family Services building, a grey concrete structure that looked more like a prison than a place meant to help families. Victor had made an appointment with Janet Rodriguez, a social worker who had been recommended by his attorney as one of the good ones. Janet met them in the waiting room, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair that spoke of years spent fighting impossible battles. She knelt down to Ava's level immediately, introducing herself with the gentle manner of someone who understood how frightening adults could be to a child who had been let down repeatedly. "I've heard you're looking for your brother," Janet said to Ava. "That's very brave of you." Ava nodded seriously. "His name is Marcus Anthony Thompson. He's 12 years old, and he likes to draw and fix things. He promised he'd find me." Janet's expression grew more troubled as she reviewed the file she had already begun assembling. In her office, a cramped space filled with overflowing filing cabinets and children's artwork taped to every available wall, she explained the complexity of Ava's situation. "Ava aged out of her last placement 6 weeks ago," Janet said, speaking to Victor, while Ava colored at a small table in the corner. "The family she was with took in 3 new children and couldn't keep her. She was supposed to be transferred to another home, but there was a bureaucratic mix-up, and she fell through the cracks." Victor felt anger rising in his chest. "How does a child simply fall through the cracks?" "More easily than you'd think," Janet replied with weary honesty. "We have over 3,000 children in the system in this city alone. Social workers carry caseloads that should be split among 3 people. Files get lost, placements fall through, and children like Ava learn to survive on their own because the system that's supposed to protect them is overwhelmed." She pulled out another file, thicker than Ava's. "Marcus was placed in a group home on the north side 8 months ago. It's a facility for older children ages 10 to 17. According to the records, he's been asking about his sister since the day he arrived." Victor felt a spark of hope. "Can we see him?" Janet's expression grew cautious. "It's not that simple. Victor, may I call you Victor? I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but the system has protocols. You can't just write a check and take custody of 2 children, even with the best intentions." "Then what can I do?" Victor asked, frustration evident in his voice. "I have resources, connections, influence. There has to be a way to help them." "There is," Janet said carefully, "but it requires patience, proper procedures, and a willingness to work within the system rather than around it. If you're serious about helping Ava and Marcus, you'll need to undergo background checks, home inspections, and a lengthy approval process to become a licensed foster parent or guardian." Victor absorbed this information, his business mind already calculating timelines and obstacles. "How long does that process take?" 3 to 6 months. if everything goes smoothly, which it rarely does. The thought of Ava spending another 6 months without her brother, navigating a system that had already failed her repeatedly, was unacceptable to Victor. But Janet's next words stopped his protests before he could voice them. However, she continued, there are temporary measures we can put in place. I can arrange for Ava to be placed in a safe, supervised environment while we work on finding a permanent solution. And I can authorize regular visits with Marcus, which might be the first step toward eventual reunification. Ava looked up from her coloring, having caught her brother's name. You can take me to see Marcus. Janet smiled at her. I'm going to try very hard to make that happen, sweetheart. As they left the building an hour later, Victor carried a folder full of forms and requirements, his introduction to a world where good intentions were not enough and money could not simply purchase solutions. But he also carried something more valuable, hope, and a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Melody died. Ava walked beside him, the drawing safely tucked in her pocket and his check folded in Janet's file. She had agreed to stay in a temporary placement facility until Victor could complete the necessary paperwork to become her guardian, but only after he promised they would visit Marcus within the week. Thank you, Mr. Victor, she said as they reached his car. Marcus is going to like you. He always said that good people show up when you need them most. Victor looked down at this remarkable little girl and realized she was right. Good people did show up when you needed them most. He was just beginning to understand that sometimes you discovered you were one of them. Victor's home office had always been his command center, the place where he orchestrated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars with nothing more than a phone call and his reputation. The mahogany desk held a leather portfolio containing business cards from every influential person he had encountered over 3 decades, senators, judges, CEOs, and civic leaders who owed him favors or sought his partnership. He spread the cards across his desk like a general planning a campaign, certain that somewhere in this collection of power and influence lay the solution to Ava and Marcus's separation. But as he began making calls, Victor discovered something that humbled him more than any business failure ever had. When it came to helping 2 vulnerable children, his impressive network was virtually useless. Victor, of course I'd love to help, said Senator Mitchell, a man whose campaign Victor had supported generously. But Children's Services operates independently from political influence. For good reason, you understand. I can make some inquiries, but I can't intervene in individual cases. Judge Hamilton, who had presided over several of Nexus Technologies' major contract disputes, was equally diplomatic but equally unhelpful. The family court system has its protocols, Victor. I can't simply override the placement process, even for a friend. By the 4th call, Victor began to understand that his business connections lived in a different world from the one that governed foster care. The people who made decisions about children's lives were social workers earning $30,000 a year, not power brokers seeking his favor. His frustration grew when his own board of directors questioned his sudden change in priorities. James Morrison, Nexus Technologies chairman, called an emergency meeting after Victor missed his 3rd consecutive executive session. Victor, I understand you want to help this child, Morrison said across the polished conference table, surrounded by concerned faces that had never worried about anything more serious than quarterly profits. But your absence is being noticed. The Singapore deal requires your personal attention, and the investors are getting nervous. Victor looked around the room at men and women who had been his closest professional associates for years and realized he barely knew them as human beings. Their concerns about stock prices and market share felt trivial compared to a little girl's need to be reunited with her brother. The Singapore deal can wait, Victor said quietly. There are more important things than profit margins. The silence that followed revealed how foreign this statement sounded coming from him. For 30 years, Victor St. James had been the man who never let personal matters interfere with business. Now he was prioritizing 2 children he had known for less than a week, over contracts worth hundreds of millions. Meanwhile, Ava was adjusting to life at Riverside Children's Home, a temporary facility that Janet had assured Victor was among the better options available. When he visited her the second day, he found her sitting in a common area filled with other displaced children, quietly working on a new drawing. "What are you making?" Victor asked, settling into the small plastic chair. Beside her, Ava held up her paper, which showed a man in a suit standing next to a little girl. Both figures were smiling, and she had carefully drawn them holding hands. "It's you and me. I wanted to show Marcus that you're really going to help us." The simple trust in her statement overwhelmed Victor. This child, who had been let down by every adult system designed to protect her, still chose to believe in his promise. Her faith in him felt like both a gift and a responsibility, unlike anything he had ever experienced. "Tell me more about the places you and Marcus lived," Victor said, genuinely wanting to understand her experience. Ava's expression grew thoughtful as she switched to a different crayon. "We were together for the first 3 homes. Mrs. Garcia was nice, but her apartment was too small when her daughter moved back. Then there was Mr. and Mrs. Chen. They really tried to help us, but Marcus got in trouble for fighting with some older boys who were picking on me." She continued coloring. As she spoke, her voice matter-of-fact despite the content. "The Johnsons were supposed to be temporary, but temporary turned into 8 months. They had 4 other kids, and Marcus said we were like furniture they forgot they owned." Victor found himself taking notes, not from professional habit, but from a genuine need to understand the system that had shaped this remarkable child's life. Every placement had taught Ava lessons no 8-year-old should need to learn: how to pack quickly, how to adapt to new rules, how to protect her heart while still hoping for something better. "The worst part," Ava continued, "was when they separated us. Marcus cried, and I'd never seen him cry before. He promised he'd find a way back to me, but 6 months is a really long time when you're 8. That evening, Victor returned to his penthouse apartment and found himself unable to focus on work for the first time in decades. He stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights, thinking about Ava sleeping in an institutional bed surrounded by strangers, and Marcus lying awake in a group home miles away, wondering if his sister was safe. His phone rang constantly with business matters that had once consumed his attention. The Singapore investors needed answers. The quarterly board meeting required preparation. Stock analysts wanted statements about Nexus Technologies' future direction. Victor let most of the calls go to voicemail. Instead, he found himself researching the foster care system, reading about sibling separation, and learning statistics that shocked him. Over 40% of children in care were separated from their siblings. The average child experienced 3 different placements before aging out of the system. Success stories like reunification and adoption were far less common than tragedies of children lost in bureaucratic labyrinths. 3 days into his transformation from businessman to advocate, Victor realized something that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. His business empire, built as a monument to his success and security, felt empty compared to the simple act of bringing hope to 2 children who needed someone to fight for them. The business cards scattered across his desk no longer represented power. They represented the limitations of a world where influence came from wealth rather than love. What Ava and Marcus needed couldn't be purchased or negotiated. It required something Victor had protected himself from for 30 years, genuine emotional investment in outcomes he couldn't control. As he prepared for his first official visit, to see Marcus the following day, Victor understood that he was embarking on the most important mission of his life, one that would require not his business acumen, but his capacity for love, a capacity he was only beginning to rediscover. The official foster care file for Marcus Anthony Thompson contained 43 pages of bureaucratic documentation that told the story of a system overwhelmed by good intentions and crippled by inadequate resources. Victor sat in Janet Rodriguez's office, methodically reading through each page, while she explained the color-coded stamps, routing numbers, and administrative codes that governed a 12-year-old boy's life. "See this red stamp here?" Janet pointed to a mark on page 16. That indicates Marcus was flagged as a special needs placement after an incident at his previous home. Victor looked up from the file. "What kind of special needs?" "Nothing medical," Janet clarified quickly. "In this context, it usually means a child who has behavioral concerns or requires additional support. In Marcus's case, he was caught trying to run away 3 times in 2 months. He was trying to find Ava," Victor said, understanding immediately. "Exactly. But the system doesn't have a category for desperately misses his sister. So he gets labeled as a flight risk, which makes placement more difficult." As Victor continued reading, a picture emerged of 2 children being systematically failed by an institution designed to protect them. Marcus's file showed a pattern of increasing desperation, good behavior when he and Ava were together, acting out whenever they were separated, and a consistent refusal to accept that the separation was permanent. One report, written by a social worker named David Chen, particularly caught Victor's attention. "Subject continues to ask daily about sister's whereabouts and refuses to engage in placement activities until informed of her status. Recommend psychological evaluation to address what appears to be an unhealthy attachment, preventing proper adjustment." Victor felt his jaw clench as he read those words. An unhealthy attachment. The system had pathologized Marcus's love for his sister, treating his loyalty as a disorder to be corrected rather than a bond to be preserved. "This is unconscionable," Victor said, his voice carrying the controlled anger he usually reserved for incompetent business partners. "How can they justify separating siblings and then criticizing the children for wanting to be together?" Janet's expression showed the weary resignation of someone who had fought these battles for years. "The system isn't designed to keep families together, Victor. It's designed to process cases efficiently. Housing siblings together is more complicated. Fewer families want 2 children, especially when one of them has been labeled as having behavioral issues." To better understand what they were fighting against, Victor hired Dr. Sarah Chen, a former social worker turned private child advocate who specialized in navigating bureaucratic systems. Dr. Chen's initial assessment was sobering. Marcus is currently placed at Northside Group Home, which houses 16 boys between the ages of 10 and 17, she reported during their first meeting. "The facility has 1 full-time counselor for all 16 children, and staff turnover is extremely high. Most employees are well-meaning but undertrained and overworked." Victor commissioned a comprehensive review of Marcus's placement history, spending money that could have purchased several luxury cars to hire investigators, child psychologists, and legal experts. What they uncovered was a systematic failure that went far beyond individual incompetence. The reports painted a picture of Marcus as an intelligent, caring child whose love for his sister had been reframed as a problem to be solved. Every attempt he made to inquire about Ava was noted as continued fixation on previous placement. His efforts to maintain hope were documented as inability to adapt to current situation. As Victor delved deeper into the system's failures, memories of his own experience began surfacing with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered the caseworker who had separated him from Melody, a tired woman named Mrs. Patterson, who spoke about what's best for both children, while clearly not understanding either of them. "Victor will do better in an academically focused environment," she had told his new family while he stood beside her, clutching a small bag containing everything he owned. "And Melody needs specialized attention for her emotional needs." Even as a 12-year-old, Victor had recognized the coded language that would follow them for years. He was gifted, and therefore valuable. Melody was troubled, and therefore difficult to place. The system had sorted them into categories based on their perceived usefulness rather than their need to remain together. The parallels between his own experience and what Marcus was enduring now were painful to acknowledge. Both boys had been old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to fight it effectively. Both had been labeled as problems when they refused to accept that their family bonds were less important than administrative convenience. Victor's investigation team made their first major breakthrough on a Friday afternoon. Dr. Chen called with news that changed everything. "I've found something significant in Marcus's file," she said, her voice carrying an excitement that had been absent from their previous conversations. "There's a medical report from 6 months ago that was misfiled in the wrong section. Marcus was hospitalized for 3 days with what was initially diagnosed as appendicitis." Victor felt his heart sink. Was he all right? "He's fine now, but here's the important part." The attending physician noted that Marcus kept asking the medical staff to contact his sister. He gave them detailed information about where Ava was living at the time, proving he had been keeping track of her even after their separation. The significance of this discovery was immediately clear. Marcus hadn't simply been pining for his sister. He had been actively maintaining knowledge of her whereabouts and well-being. This demonstrated the kind of protective instinct and family connection that should have been celebrated rather than pathologized. More importantly, the medical file contained contact information for the family who had been caring for Ava at the time of Marcus's hospitalization. It was a lead that could help them trace her movements through the system and potentially uncover why she had ended up living on the streets. "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued. The physician's notes mentioned that Marcus drew pictures for the nursing staff, detailed drawings of houses, families, and what he called the place where me and Ava will live when we're together again. Victor closed his eyes, remembering Ava's careful preservation of her brother's artwork. Even while hospitalized and scared, Marcus had been creating images of hope and reunion. The same impulse that led him to draw that original picture for Ava had continued throughout their separation. That evening, Victor sat in his study with the complete file spread across his desk, 43 pages of bureaucratic documentation, but between the lines was the story of a boy who refused to stop loving his sister despite a system that treated that love as an inconvenience. For the first time since beginning this journey, Victor felt genuine hope. They had found Marcus, they understood his situation, and they had evidence that his bond with Ava remained strong despite months of separation. But as Victor prepared for his first meeting with the boy, who reminded him so much of his younger self, he realized that finding Marcus was only the beginning. Reuniting him with Ava would require dismantling the very system that had torn them apart, a challenge that would test every skill Victor had developed over his lifetime, and some he was only beginning to discover. The death certificate had lived in Victor's safe deposit box for 30 years, sealed in an envelope he had never found the courage to open. But as he prepared to meet Marcus for the first time, something compelled him to drive to First National Bank and retrieve the document that contained the official record of his greatest failure. Melody Catherine St. James. Date of death: October 15th, 1995. Cause of death: acute myocarditis secondary to untreated streptococcal infection. Age at death: 15 years, 4 months, 12 days. Victor sat in his car outside the bank, reading the clinical language that reduced his sister's life and death to medical terminology. What the certificate couldn't capture was the week of phone calls he had made, trying to get someone to take her symptoms seriously, the 3 different foster homes that had dismissed her complaints of chest pain as attention-seeking behavior, or the final desperate conversation when she whispered to him over a payphone that she was scared because her heart felt like it was breaking. "It's just sadness," the social worker had told him when he called begging for someone to check on Melody. "Some children have trouble adjusting to placement changes. She'll be fine once she settles in. She wasn't fine. She died alone in a hospital room while Victor sat in his college dormitory, unaware that his sister was fighting for her life just 30 miles away. By the time anyone notified him, it was too late to say goodbye, too late to fulfill his promise that he would always protect her. The parallels between Melody's situation and what Marcus was currently enduring were impossible to ignore. Both were older siblings, separated from younger ones they felt responsible for protecting. Both had been labeled as problems when they refused to accept that family bonds were less important than administrative convenience. Both had found themselves trapped in a system that pathologized love and loyalty. That afternoon, Victor visited Ava at Riverside Children's Home, carrying the weight of memories he had spent 3 decades trying to forget. She was in the art room, working on another drawing, while several other children played around her. "I'm making this for Marcus," she said, showing Victor a picture of 3 people standing in front of a large house. "It's you and me and him, together." Victor studied the drawing, noting how carefully Ava had made all 3 figures the same height, as if equality in the picture could manifest equality in reality. She had drawn herself and Marcus holding hands, with Victor standing slightly apart, but clearly part of the group. "Ava," Victor said gently, "I need to tell you something about tomorrow. We're going to see Marcus, but he's in a place where he might be scared or angry. He's been without you for a long time, and sometimes that makes people feel different ways." Ava nodded seriously. "Marcus gets angry when he's scared, but he's never angry at me, only at the people who make bad things happen." Her simple wisdom hit Victor like a revelation. Ava understood her brother in ways that social workers with graduate degrees had failed to grasp. Marcus's behavioral issues weren't pathology. They were the natural response of a child forced to live in an unnatural situation. Dr. Chen called that evening with news that complicated everything. "I've spoken with the director at Northside. Group home. Marcus is currently in what they call intensive supervision, following an incident last week." Victor felt his stomach drop. What kind of incident? He tried to run away again, but this time he made it nearly 15 miles before. Police found him. He had stolen a city bus map and was trying to navigate to Riverside Children's Home to find Ava. The image of a 12-year-old boy walking 15 miles with nothing but hope and a bus map broke something open in Victor's chest. It was exactly what he would have done at Marcus's age, exactly the kind of desperate loyalty that had driven him to search for Melody until the day she died. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "The facility is recommending that Marcus be transferred to a more restrictive environment. They're saying he's become a danger to himself and others." Victor's anger was immediate and overwhelming. A danger to others for trying to find his sister. "I know how it sounds, Victor, but we have to work within their framework. If Marcus gets labeled as dangerous, it becomes much harder to get him placed in a family setting." That night, Victor couldn't concentrate on anything. His business was suffering from his distraction. The Singapore deal had stalled, 2 major contracts were in jeopardy, and his board of directors was scheduling another emergency meeting to discuss his fitness to lead. But for the first time in his adult life, Victor found that he didn't care about profit margins or stock prices. His assistant, Sarah, had begun routing calls to other executives, explaining that Mr. St. James was dealing with a family emergency. The irony wasn't lost on Victor. He was claiming a family emergency to help children who weren't legally his family, while ignoring the business family that had supported him for decades. James Morrison cornered him after a brief appearance at the quarterly review meeting. "Victor, I've known you for 15 years and I've never seen you like this. What's really going on?" Victor found himself looking at Morrison, a man he had considered a friend but had never shared a personal conversation with, and realizing how hollow his professional relationships had become. "I'm trying to save 2 children from a system that nearly destroyed me," Victor said simply. And I'm discovering that everything I thought was important actually isn't. Morrison's confusion was evident. But the business, Victor, everything we've built together, you can't just walk away from your responsibilities. I'm not walking away from responsibility, Victor replied. I'm finally walking toward it. As Victor prepared for the visit to Northside Group home, he carried the weight of his sister's death certificate in his jacket pocket. For 30 years, he had convinced himself that his failure to save Melody was proof that love wasn't enough, that only money and power could provide real security. But Ava's unwavering faith in their reunion and Marcus's 15-mile walk, powered by nothing but hope, were teaching him something his business empire never could. Sometimes love was the only thing that mattered, and sometimes it was powerful enough to overcome systems designed to break it. The boy he was going to meet tomorrow had been reduced to case files and behavioral reports, labeled as a problem to be managed rather than a child to be loved. But Victor knew better now. Marcus wasn't broken. He was beautifully, courageously human, fighting for the same thing Victor had lost when Melody died, the chance to protect someone he loved more than his own safety. Tomorrow would be the first step toward giving them both something Victor had never had, the chance to keep that love alive. The call came at 3 a.m, jolting Victor from the first peaceful sleep he had experienced in weeks. Dr. Chen's voice was tight with urgency and something else: disbelief. "Victor, you need to get to St. Mary's Hospital immediately. Marcus is in the emergency room." Victor was already reaching for his clothes. "What happened?" "He collapsed at the group home around midnight. They're saying it's severe dehydration and malnutrition, but Victor," her voice broke, "there's something else, something I don't understand how to tell you." 20 minutes later, Victor stood in the fluorescent-lit hallway of St. Mary's Hospital, staring at a building he had sworn never to enter again. This was where Melody had died, where he had made promises to her lifeless body that had shaped 30 years of his existence. Now fate had brought him back to fight for another child's life in the same place where he had lost his sister. Dr. Chen met him at the elevator, her face pale with exhaustion and shock. "Before we go up, there's something you need to know. I pulled Marcus's complete medical history to give to the doctors, and I found records going back to when he was born." She handed Victor a manila folder. "Look at the social worker who handled his initial placement." Victor opened the file and felt the ground shift beneath him. The signature at the bottom of Marcus's first placement document belonged to Linda Patterson, the same Linda Patterson who had been responsible for Melody's case 30 years ago. The woman who had dismissed his sister's medical complaints as attention-seeking behavior was now working with a new generation of vulnerable children. "She's still in the system," Dr. Chen said quietly, "still making decisions about children's lives. And Marcus has been in her caseload for the past 8 months. The coincidence was too significant to ignore. Victor felt the universe closing a circle that had been open since the day Melody died, offering him a chance to confront not just his own failure, but the systemic failure that had killed his sister and was now threatening Marcus. They found Marcus in pediatric intensive care, his 12-year-old body looking impossibly small against the white hospital bed. Machines monitored his vital signs with electronic beeps that echoed the sounds Victor remembered from Melody's final days. But where his sister had been alone, Marcus had visitors. Ava sat in a chair beside his bed, holding his hand and speaking to him in a voice so gentle it broke Victor's heart. Janet Rodriguez had brought her from Riverside Children's Home, despite hospital regulations, understanding that sometimes love mattered more than policy. "I brought your drawing," Ava was saying to her unconscious brother. "The one of our house. I told them you're the best artist in the whole world, and when you wake up, you can teach the nurses how to draw too." Victor approached the bed slowly, taking in Marcus's appearance. Even unconscious, the boy's face showed intelligence and determination. His features resembled Ava's, but where she carried hope despite hardship, Marcus showed the weight of responsibility that came from being an older sibling in an impossible situation. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the attending physician, pulled Victor aside to explain Marcus's condition. Severe dehydration suggests he hasn't been eating or drinking properly for weeks. We're also seeing signs of chronic stress and what appears to be untreated respiratory issues. How does a child in state care become malnourished? Victor asked, his voice carrying dangerous calm. Dr. Morrison's expression darkened. That's a question for the authorities. What I can tell you is that this boy's condition suggests systemic neglect. The group home claims he was eating normally, but his blood work tells a different story. Victor studied Marcus's medical chart, noting parallels to Melody's case that made his hands shake with suppressed rage. Both children had shown symptoms that were dismissed by caregivers. Both had tried to communicate their distress and been labeled as difficult. Both had been failed by a system that treated their complaints as behavioral problems rather than medical emergencies. As the morning progressed, more details emerged that painted a picture of institutional neglect bordering on abuse. Marcus had been placed on restricted meals as punishment for his escape attempts. His respiratory issues, likely asthma triggered by stress, had been ignored because treating them would have required expensive medical evaluation. When he complained of feeling weak, staff assumed he was faking illness to avoid group activities. Linda Patterson arrived at the hospital around noon, a woman in her 60s with grey hair and the tired expression of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions about other people's children. Victor recognized her immediately, though she showed no sign of remembering him. "Mr. St. James," she said with professional politeness, "I understand you've taken an interest in the Thompson children. While I appreciate your concern, Marcus is receiving appropriate care, and his placement will be re-evaluated once he's medically stable." Victor looked at this woman who had failed his sister and was now failing Marcus, and felt 30 years of buried rage crystallize into cold determination. "Ms. Patterson, do you remember a case from 1995? A 15-year-old girl named Melody St. James who died of untreated streptococcal infection while in your care?" Linda's face went pale. That was a long time ago. I handle hundreds of cases. She was my sister," Victor said quietly. "And she died because you refused to take her medical complaints seriously, just like you've been ignoring Marcus's needs for the past 8 months. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Linda Patterson looked from Victor to Marcus's unconscious form, understanding for the first time that this wasn't a random act of charity, but something far more personal. "Mr. St. James, I'm sorry for your loss, but every placement decision I make is in the best interest of the children involved. Sometimes difficult children require structured environments." Difficult children. Victor's voice carried the controlled fury of 3 decades. Or children who refuse to stop loving their siblings. Children who won't accept that your convenience matters more than their family bonds. Dr. Chen stepped forward, recognizing that the confrontation was escalating beyond productive discussion. "Perhaps we should focus on Marcus's immediate needs rather than—" "No," Victor interrupted. "This is exactly what we should be discussing, because this isn't an isolated incident or a tragic coincidence. This is a pattern of systemic failure that has been going on for decades." He pulled out his phone and showed Linda Patterson a photograph of the hospital bracelet he had found in his sister's belongings, a plastic band with Melody's name and the same room number where Marcus was now fighting for his life. "My sister died in this room 30 years ago because the system failed her. Now Marcus is fighting for his life in the same place because the same system, run by the same people, has failed him. The only difference is that this time someone with resources is paying attention." Linda Patterson left without responding, but Victor knew the real battle was just beginning. He had unintentionally declared war on the entire system that had destroyed his family and was threatening to destroy another. That evening, as Ava fell asleep in the chair beside Marcus's bed, Victor made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't just going to save 2 children. He was going to expose the systemic failures that had killed his sister and nearly killed Marcus. He was going to use every resource at his disposal to ensure that Linda Patterson and others like her could never again dismiss a child's suffering as inconvenient behavior. The fight ahead would require more than money or influence. It would require Victor to relive his deepest trauma, confront his own guilt, and risk everything he had built to honor the promise he had made at Melody's grave. But as he watched Ava's small hand clasped around her brother's fingers, Victor knew he had no choice. Some battles were worth more than business empires, and some promises were worth keeping even when they came 30 years too late. Victor's conference room had been transformed into a war room. The polished table that once hosted discussions about profit margins and market expansion now held legal briefs, case files, and investigative reports documenting 30 years of systemic failures in the city's foster care system. He had assembled a team that represented the best of what money could buy and what passion could inspire. At the head of the table sat Margaret Chen, one of the nation's leading civil rights attorneys and Dr. Sarah Chen's older sister. She had taken the case not for the substantial fee Victor offered, but because she had spent her career fighting for children who had no voice in systems designed to protect them. "We have enough evidence to file suit against the Department of Children and Family Services, the group home where Marcus was neglected, and Linda Patterson individually," Margaret said, spreading documents across the table. "But Victor, you need to understand what you're declaring war on. This isn't just about 2 children anymore. You're challenging an entire institutional structure." Beside her sat David Kim, an investigative journalist whose series on foster care failures had won a Pulitzer Prize 3 years earlier. He had been documenting cases similar to Marcus and Ava's for over a decade, building a database of systemic neglect that stretched across multiple states. "I found 17 other cases handled by Linda Patterson over the past 5 years," David reported. Children who were dismissed as difficult when they tried to maintain contact with siblings, who were punished for showing symptoms of trauma, who were failed by a system that prioritized compliance over care. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma and family separation, had spent the previous week interviewing other children who had passed through the same facilities as Marcus and Ava. Her findings painted a picture of institutional abuse disguised as therapeutic intervention. "These children aren't broken," she explained to the assembled team. "They're responding normally to abnormal circumstances. When we pathologize their grief and loyalty, we're essentially punishing them for loving their families." The legal brief that Margaret had prepared was unlike anything Victor had encountered in his business career. Rather than focusing on individual damages, it proposed systemic reform that would require the city to completely restructure how it approached sibling placement and family preservation. The document was 847 pages long and represented a direct challenge to decades of established practice. "This brief isn't just about Marcus and Ava," Margaret explained to Victor during a private moment. "If we win, we'll be setting precedent for thousands of other children. But if we lose, the system will likely become more entrenched and defensive than ever." Victor studied the legal document that would serve as their primary weapon in the fight ahead. Page after page detailed the failures that had led to his sister's death and Marcus's hospitalization, supported by expert testimony and statistical analysis that made institutional neglect impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents. "I understand the risks," Victor said finally, "but the cost of doing nothing is higher than the cost of failure." Marcus's medical condition had stabilized after 3 days in intensive care, but his recovery revealed the depth of psychological trauma he had endured. When he finally woke up, his first words were, "Where's Ava?" followed immediately by, "Are they going to separate us again?" Victor's first conversation with Marcus took place in the hospital room where his sister had died. 30 years earlier, the boy was cautious but intelligent, studying Victor with the same careful assessment that Ava had shown during their initial meeting. "Ava says, 'You're going to help us stay together,'" Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned not to trust adult promises. "But grown-ups say a lot of things they don't mean." "You're right to be cautious," Victor replied honestly. "Adults have let you down before. But I'm not making you a promise. I'm making you a commitment. There's a difference." Marcus considered this distinction with the seriousness of someone far older than 12. "What's the difference? A promise is something you hope to keep. A commitment is something you'll die before you break." For the first time since waking up, Marcus smiled, an expression that transformed his face and revealed the boy he had been before the system wore him down. "Ava was right about you. She said you talk like someone who means what they say." Victor's business empire was crumbling while he fought for the Thompson children, but he discovered he no longer cared about stock prices or board meetings. His assistant Sarah had begun forwarding calls to other executives, explaining that Mr. St. James was dealing with family matters that require his immediate attention. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after Marcus's hospitalization. Victor arrived to find 12 concerned faces around the conference table, including several major investors who had flown in specifically to address his recent behavior. James Morrison led the intervention with the careful tone of someone addressing a friend's mental breakdown. "Victor, we're all concerned about you. This situation with these children, while admirable, has become an obsession that's affecting your judgment and our company's stability." Victor looked around the table at men and women who had been his professional family for decades and realized they were speaking a language he no longer understood. Their concerns about profit margins and market share felt like conversations from another lifetime. "Gentlemen, ladies," Victor said quietly, "I've called this meeting to inform you that I'm stepping down as CEO, effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard Walsh, the company's largest external investor, was the first to speak. "Victor, that's not necessary. Take a sabbatical, get some perspective, but don't make any irreversible decisions while you're emotionally compromised." "I'm not emotionally compromised," Victor replied. "I'm emotionally awakened. For the first time in 30 years, I understand what actually matters." He stood and walked to the window that provided his expensive view of the city below. "I built this company as a monument to my own security, proof that I could never again be powerless like I was when my sister died. But power without purpose is just sophisticated emptiness." Victor turned back to face the board. "I'm transferring my shares to a trust that will benefit children aging out of the foster care system. You'll have a new CEO by the end of the month, and Nexus Technologies will continue to thrive. But I have more important work to do." The media attention began building as word spread about Victor's transformation from isolated billionaire to child advocate. David Kim's initial article about the Thompson case had generated national interest, particularly among readers who recognized the broader implications of sibling separation in foster care. Ava, who had never spoken to a reporter in her life, surprised everyone with her composure during a carefully arranged interview. When asked why she believed Victor would keep his promises when so many adults had disappointed her, she gave an answer that became the headline for every major newspaper in the country. "He doesn't look at us like we're broken things that need fixing," she said. "He looks at us like we're people who deserve to be loved." The simple statement crystallized public sentiment in ways that legal briefs and expert testimony couldn't match. Within days, Victor's office was receiving calls from other families separated by the foster care system, other siblings who had been told that their love for each other was an obstacle to proper placement. Dr. Rodriguez brought Victor a stack of letters from children around the country who had heard about Marcus and Ava's story. "They want to share their experiences," she explained. Children who have been punished for refusing to forget their siblings, who have been medicated for grieving their families, who have been labeled as problems for wanting what every human being needs: connection and love. The night before their court hearing, Victor sat with Marcus and Ava in the hospital room that had once symbolized his greatest failure and now represented his most important mission. Marcus was scheduled to be discharged the following morning, directly into Victor's temporary custody, while the legal proceedings determined his permanent placement. "Are you scared?" Ava asked her brother, taking his hand in the same protective gesture Victor had seen in their first drawing. "A little," Marcus admitted, "but not of the judge or the lawyers. I'm scared that if this doesn't work, they'll send me somewhere even further away from you." Victor looked at these two children who had endured more hardship in their young lives than most adults faced in decades, yet still chose to hope, still chose to love, still chose to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. "Whatever happens in that courtroom," Victor said, "you won't be separated again. That's not a promise, that's a commitment." As he prepared for the most important battle of his life, Victor carried the weight of his sister's memory and the hope of two children who had taught him that love was not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be honored. Tomorrow, he would find out if the system that had failed Melody 30 years ago was capable of change, or if it would take everything he had built to tear it down and build something better in its place. Judge Patricia Williams presided over family court with the gravity of someone who had spent 25 years making decisions that shaped children's lives. Her gavel, polished mahogany with brass fittings, had rendered verdicts in thousands of cases involving custody, adoption, and the complex intersection of family love and legal necessity. As she called the emergency hearing to order, that gavel represented the only hope Marcus and Ava had for remaining together. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, filled with social workers, child advocates, reporters, and families who had traveled from across the state to witness what many considered a test case for foster care reform. Victor sat at the plaintiff's table beside Margaret Chen, watching as Linda Patterson took her place with the city's legal team. 5 attorneys in expensive suits whose job was to defend a system that had failed countless children. Margaret's opening statement was surgical in its precision. "Your Honor, this case appears to be about 2 children seeking reunification with each other and permanent placement with Mr. St. James. In reality, it's about a system that has systematically punished children for loving their families, pathologized normal grief responses, and prioritized administrative convenience over human dignity." She gestured toward Marcus and Ava, who sat in the first row behind Victor. Marcus still showed signs of his recent hospitalization, pale skin and the careful movements of someone recovering from serious illness. Ava held his hand tightly, her small fingers intertwined with his in a gesture that spoke more powerfully than any legal argument. These children have been separated for 8 months, not because they were unsafe together, but because the system found it easier to place them separately. Marcus Thompson has been labeled as behaviorally challenging for the crime of missing. His sister, Ava Thompson, has been classified as overly dependent for refusing to accept that her brother was gone forever. The city's lead attorney, Robert Morrison, presented the standard defense. "Your Honor, placement decisions are made based on the best interests of the children involved. Marcus Thompson's behavioral issues required specialized intervention that wasn't available in family settings. The department followed established protocols, Margaret interrupted, that have been unchanged since 1985. Despite decades of research showing the harmful effects of sibling separation." Judge Williams raised her hand for silence. "I'll hear testimony from all parties before making any determinations. Mr. St. James, please take the stand." Victor's testimony began with his professional credentials, his business success, his financial stability, his ability to provide for Marcus and Ava's material needs. But Margaret quickly guided him toward more personal territory. "Mr. St. James, why did you become involved with the Thompson children?" Victor looked directly at Judge Williams as he answered, "Because they reminded me of my sister and myself 30 years ago. We were separated by the same system, handled by some of the same people, and I watched my sister die because no one with power cared enough to fight for her." The courtroom stirred as Victor revealed details of Melody's case, Linda Patterson's dismissal of her medical complaints, the institutional neglect that led to her death, the parallels between her experience and Marcus's recent hospitalization. "Mr. St. James," the city's attorney objected during cross-examination, "isn't it true that your involvement with these children is motivated more by guilt over your sister's death than by their actual best interests?" Victor considered the question carefully. "You're absolutely right that my sister's death motivated my initial involvement. But spending these past months with Marcus and Ava has taught me something I didn't understand when Melody died. Sometimes guilt can be transformed into purpose, and sometimes our deepest wounds can become our greatest source of strength." When Ava took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Williams had arranged for a child advocate to assist with questioning, but Ava spoke with a clarity that needed no interpretation. "The lady says Marcus has problems," Ava said, looking directly at Linda Patterson. "But he doesn't have problems. He just misses me. I miss him too, but nobody calls that a problem when I do it." Margaret Chen knelt beside the witness stand. "Ava, what would happen if you and Marcus couldn't live together?" Ava's answer was immediate and heartbreaking. "Then we'd both be broken, but not in the way they think. We'd be broken in our hearts, and you can't fix that kind of broken by sending us to different houses." Linda Patterson's testimony revealed the institutional mindset that had governed decades of placement decisions. She defended Marcus's separation from Ava as therapeutic intervention and dismissed his escape attempts as attention-seeking behavior that required structured response. Under Margaret's questioning, she admitted she had never asked Marcus why he wanted to find his sister, never considered whether their separation might be causing his behavioral issues, and never reviewed the research on sibling attachment in foster care. "Ms. Patterson," Margaret asked, "in your 30 years of social work, how many siblings have you successfully kept together?" The silence stretched uncomfortably before Linda answered, "I don't keep statistics on that particular metric. Would it surprise you to learn that your department's records show you've separated siblings in 87% of your cases over the past 5 years? The revelation sent murmurs through the courtroom. Margaret continued, "And that children in your caseload are 3 times more likely to experience placement failure than those handled by other social workers." As Linda Patterson's credibility crumbled under examination, Marcus suddenly collapsed in the courtroom gallery. The stress of the proceedings, combined with his still fragile health, overwhelmed his system. Victor immediately rushed to his side. As paramedics were called, "I'm okay," Marcus whispered as Victor knelt beside him. "Don't let them use this as an excuse to separate us again." Judge Williams called for a brief recess as Marcus was stabilized, but his collapse had made the stakes undeniably clear. This wasn't an academic discussion about policy. It was about a boy whose body was breaking down from the trauma of forced separation from his sister. When court reconvened, Judge Williams looked tired but resolute. "I've heard enough testimony to understand the fundamental issues in this case. However, before I render my decision, I want to hear from Marcus Thompson himself." Marcus approached the witness stand with careful steps, still pale but determined. When Judge Williams asked him what he wanted most in the world, his answer was simple. "I want to take care of my sister like I promised our mama I would. And I want someone to let me love her without saying there's something wrong with me for it." The gavel in Judge Williams' hand seemed to carry the weight of every decision she had ever made as she prepared to rule on a case that would determine not just the fate of 2 children, but the future of sibling relationships in foster care. Judge Williams set her gavel down with deliberate care, the polished wood making contact with the bench in a sound that seemed to echo through 30 years of Victor's life. The courtroom held its breath as she prepared to deliver a ruling that would determine whether love or bureaucracy would prevail. In 30 years on this bench, Judge Williams began, I have never encountered a case that so clearly illustrates the gap between our intentions and our actions in child welfare. We have created a system designed to protect children that has instead traumatized them in the name of their own best interests. She looked directly at Marcus and Ava, who sat together in the front row, their hands clasped with the desperate intensity of two people afraid they might be torn apart again. Marcus Thompson, you have been labeled as having behavioral problems for the simple act of loving your sister. Ava Thompson, you have been classified as overly dependent for refusing to abandon hope of reunion. These labels represent a fundamental misunderstanding of what family means and what children need to thrive. Victor felt his heart racing as Judge Williams continued. Mr. St. James, your transformation from successful businessman to child advocate demonstrates something profound, that healing others can heal ourselves, and that the love we give away often returns to us multiplied. The judge picked up her gavel again, holding it like the symbol of justice it was meant to be. I am granting immediate guardianship of Marcus and Ava Thompson to Victor St. James, with the intention of moving toward full adoption pending completion of standard procedures. The courtroom erupted in applause, but Judge Williams wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering a comprehensive review of sibling placement policies within the Department of Children and Family Services. Ms. Patterson, you are hereby removed from all active cases pending investigation into your handling of the Thompson children and other siblings in your care. Victor watched as Linda Patterson's face went white with shock and anger. After 30 years of unchecked authority over vulnerable children, she was finally being held accountable for the damage she had caused. This court also orders the establishment of a sibling preservation task force, funded by private donations and overseen by independent child welfare experts. The goal will be to ensure that what happened to Marcus and Ava and to Mr. St. James's sister 30 years ago never happens again. As the gavel fell for the final time, Victor felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had carried since the day Melody died. But his attention was immediately drawn to Marcus, who had started crying, not from sadness, but from relief. So profound it overwhelmed his young body. Ava wrapped her arms around her brother, whispering the same words of comfort he had given her during their worst nights on the streets. It's okay, Marcus. We're together now. Nobody's going to separate us anymore. Victor knelt beside them, and for the first time in his life, felt what it meant to be part of a real family. Not the professional associations he had mistaken for relationships, or the business partnerships he had called friendships, but the bone-deep connection that came from choosing to love people regardless of the cost. Are we really going to live with you? Marcus asked, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. If you want to, Victor replied, but I want you to understand something. I'm not just taking care of you. You're taking care of me too. You're giving me something I thought I'd lost forever. That evening, in Victor's penthouse apartment that had been transformed from a showcase of wealth into a home preparing for children, Ava presented him with something that would become his most treasured possession. It was a handwritten thank you note, carefully printed in the block letters Marcus had taught her, decorated with crayon drawings of hearts and flowers. Dear Mr. Victor, the note read, thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for fighting the mean people who wanted to keep us apart. Thank you for showing us that grown-ups can keep their promises. Marcus says you're the best daddy we could have asked for, and I think so too. Love, Ava and Marcus Thompson St. James. The hyphenated last name was Ava's addition, her way of declaring that they were truly a family now. Victor held the note. with hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts. But no document had ever meant more to him than these simple words written by a little girl who had chosen to love him. 3 weeks later, Marcus had fully recovered his strength and was enrolled in the same private school that Ava would attend in the fall. Victor had hired tutors to help them both catch up academically, but he was amazed by their natural intelligence and resilience. Marcus showed particular talent for mathematics and art, often combining the two in drawings that solved complex spatial and problems. Ava had a gift for languages and could pick up new vocabulary with startling speed. But more than their intellectual abilities, Victor was struck by their capacity for joy. Children who had every reason to be bitter or broken instead chose to find wonder in simple things: a comfortable bed, regular meals, and the security of knowing they would wake up in the same house tomorrow. They had taught Victor that happiness wasn't something to be purchased or achieved, but something to be chosen daily through acts of love and gratitude. The foundation Victor established with his Nexus Technologies shares had already helped reunite 47 sibling groups in its first month of operation. Dr. Elena Rodriguez served as its director, and Janet Rodriguez had left the Department of Children and Family Services to work full-time on policy reform. But Victor's greatest achievement wasn't measured in children reunited or policies changed. It was measured in moments like bedtime stories with Marcus and Ava, family dinners around a table that had never heard laughter before, and the simple miracle of going to sleep each night knowing he would be missed if he didn't wake up. The man, who had spent 30 years building walls around his heart, had discovered that love, not money, was the only true security. And 2 children who had been labeled as problems by a broken system had proven that families weren't defined by law or biology, but by the choice to stay together when everything else fell apart. 6 months after the courtroom victory that changed everything, Victor St. James stood in his kitchen making breakfast for his children, a phrase that still filled him with wonder every time he thought it. The penthouse apartment had been transformed from a sterile showcase into a home alive with laughter, scattered homework, and the comfortable chaos that came with raising 2 intelligent, creative children. Marcus sat at the kitchen island, carefully, working on architectural drawings for a school project. At 13, he had grown 2 inches and gained 15 pounds, his face filling out with the health that came from regular meals and unconditional love. The drawings he created now showed fantastical buildings designed specifically for families, houses with connecting rooms that could never be separated, bridges between bedrooms to ensure siblings could always reach each other. Ava was practicing violin at the dining room table, her music stand surrounded by books about marine biology and space exploration. At 9, she approached learning with the same determination she had shown while searching for her brother. But now her energy was focused on discovery rather than survival. Her latest obsession was octopuses, which she found fascinating because they're really smart, but people think they're weird, just like kids in foster care. The framed photograph on Victor's desk showed the 3 of them together at a local park, taken the day the adoption was finalized. It was a candid shot, Victor pushing Ava on a swing while Marcus climbed on the jungle gym behind them, all of them laughing at something Ava had said about a particularly dignified squirrel. The photographer had captured a moment of pure joy, the kind that could only exist when people felt completely safe with each other. Victor studied that photograph every morning as he drank his coffee, still amazed by the family they had become. The man in the picture looked nothing like the isolated billionaire who had written $1 million check to a homeless child 8 months earlier. That man had been successful but empty, wealthy but poor in everything that mattered. The man in the photograph was truly rich for the first time in his life. The St. James Foundation for Sibling Preservation had grown into a national organization that had helped reunite over 200 sibling groups while advocating for systemic changes in foster care policy. Victor's business empire, now run by capable executives who shared his commitment to social responsibility, generated profits that funded expansion into 12 states. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stopped by every few weeks to check on Marcus and Ava's adjustment, though her visits had evolved from professional obligations into family friendship. She often brought her own children to play with Victor's, creating the kind of extended family network that both Marcus and Ava had dreamed about during their loneliest nights. "They're remarkable kids," Dr. Rodriguez told Victor during her most recent visit, watching Marcus patiently teach Ava how to solve a complex math problem. "Not just resilient, but genuinely happy. That's rarer than you might think among children who've experienced trauma." Victor understood what she meant. Marcus and Ava hadn't just survived their experience with the foster care system, they had transformed it into wisdom that helped them appreciate what they now had. They didn't take family dinners for granted because they remembered being hungry. They didn't complain about household chores because they remembered feeling unwanted. They cherished bedtime stories because they remembered nights when no one cared if they felt scared. The changes in Victor's own life ran even deeper than his role as a father. He had rediscovered parts of himself that had been buried since Melody's death. His capacity for playfulness, his ability to find joy in simple moments, his willingness to be vulnerable with people he loved. Marcus and Ava had taught him that strength wasn't about building walls to protect yourself from loss, but about being brave enough to love fully despite the possibility of pain. Linda Patterson had been removed from her position and was facing professional review that would likely end her career in social work. The investigation into her cases had revealed a pattern of negligence that spanned decades, affecting hundreds of children who had been labeled as problems for displaying normal human emotions. Several families had come forward with stories similar to Marcus and Ava's, creating a groundswell of support for reform that extended far beyond Victor's individual advocacy. Janet Rodriguez had been promoted to oversee the implementation of new sibling placement policies that prioritize keeping families together whenever possible. The protocols she developed were being studied by child welfare agencies across the country as a model for reform that actually put children's needs first. On this particular morning, as Victor helped Marcus with his backpack and reminded Ava to bring her science project to school, he felt the same contentment that had eluded him throughout his business career. The satisfaction of watching his children grow and thrive, of knowing that his daily actions were contributing to their happiness and security, filled a void that no amount of professional success had ever touched. "Dad," Marcus said as they walked toward the car. He had started calling Victor Dad 3 months after the adoption, a moment that had brought tears to Victor's eyes. "Do you ever miss your old life, when it was just you and you didn't have to worry about anyone else?" Victor considered the question as he held the car door open for his children. "You know what I miss about my old life? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The man I was before I met you and Ava wasn't really living. He was just existing. You two taught me the difference." Ava looked up at him with the same honey-colored eyes that had captivated him that first day beside the dumpster. "We taught you something? But you're the grown-up." "The best grown-ups never stop learning," Victor replied, buckling her seatbelt. "And the best teachers are often the people who need our help the most. You and Marcus didn't just let me help you, you saved me right back." As they drove toward school, Victor reflected on the journey that had brought them together. It had started with a $1 million check offered impulsively to a homeless child, but money had turned out to be the least important part of the equation. What had really mattered was the decision to open his heart to love again, despite the risks that came with caring deeply about other people. The foundation would continue its work, helping other siblings stay together and reforming a system that had failed too many children for too long. But Victor's greatest legacy wouldn't be measured in policies changed or children reunited. It would be measured in the family he had chosen and who had chosen him back, proving that love, not wealth, was the only currency that could truly change the world. That evening, as he tucked Marcus and Ava into their beds and listened to their prayers of gratitude for simple things like safety and family, Victor understood that he had finally kept the promise he made at Melody's grave 30 years ago. He had become powerful enough to protect the people he loved, not through money or influence, but through the transformative force of unconditional love.